to pose problems or create the right conditions for intensities to circulate so that individuation and trans-individuation can occur without being short-circuited, we must believe in the body. But as in the germ of life, the seed which splits open the paving stones, which has been preserved and lives on in the holy shroud, or the mummy's bandages, and which bears witness to life in this world as it is. This belief in that which is incommunicable, the unthought and the untimely, which is not constrained by the dogmatic image of thought, nor by time in the sense of the present, the eternal or the historical, but is that which acts counter to and thus counter-actualizes our time for the benefit of a yet to come, people yet to come, but in the here and now. This acting counter to or counter-actualization can be thought of in terms of three non-successive moments contained in each other, unfolding through each other, or, to put it another way, one moment with three aspects. These three aspects can, moreover, be thought of descriptively as part detective novel, part science fiction novel, and part apocalyptic novel. Detective for its posing of problems and concomitant creation of concepts, which themselves change along with the problems through practices of what anarchists have described as prefiguration, or the creation of metastable conditions that allow for individuation and trans-individuation to occur without being short-circuited. Science fiction for its utopian dimension, the yet to come, an encounter as a here and now, or rather as an era one, from which emerges inexhaustibly ever new, differently distributed heres and nows. This is a response to a problem correctly raised at the level of practice, a partial and relative resolution of a disparation or tension between two orders, what Stegler might call adoption, and finally, apocalyptic for the throw of the dice, the willing of the eternal return, the secret repetition, and the secret of an insistence in all our existence, a universal ungrounding which turns upon itself and causes only the yet to come.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce our guest in today's discussion, we just want to mention we do have a Patreon account, patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. But if not, it'd be great if you could perhaps leave us a nice review on iTunes. We appreciate those just as much. Today, Taylor and I are proud to bring you this week's guest, Chantelle Gray, who is professor in the School of Philosophy at Northwest University and the co-editor of Deleuze and Anarchism and the author of today's discussion or focus of discussion, Anarchism After Deleuze and Guattari, Fabulating Futures. So Chantelle, welcome to the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. We're very excited to dig into your work. This is something that is a nice kind of synergy for me because I kind of started out in this kind of field of post-anarchism as a field of interest many, many years ago. And so I think that's kind of why I'm here and doing this podcast, at least partially. So just wanted to share that with you and welcome you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. And it's quite interesting to hear that that's your little trajectory. So yeah, thanks for sharing.
I was telling Chantelle Taylor a little bit about my background and kind of my MA in mass communication with an emphasis in social media and kind of how I had actually uncovered Saul Newman's work as a part of a research project. And that's kind of what put me, I had some exposure to Derrida and stuff before that, but that really kind of grabbed my attention. So
Derrida, not quite famous for being an anarchist, though.
Well,
right? So
well, I'm just saying like that kind of, Derrida was before this.
the synergy really is Coop's got this background in anarchism. I mean, he's the one that introduced me to Saul Newman and got me reading a little bit of Stirner, things like this. And I think that I brought to Coop this kind of incipient love for like Deleuze and Guattari and some of these other thinkers. No, but the two of us together, we're like the perfect little collective assemblage for this discussion today. Yes.
That's excellent. Yeah, I think post-anarchism is quite an interesting, it's an interesting little field because it just burst out of nowhere and suddenly a lot of work was being done and now it's also kind of disappeared into
Right,
nowhere.
yeah, I agree.
So it was this kind of short little bubble of stuff happening. But I think it was interesting. There's a lot of books kind of got written in that time and just, not only in terms of Deleuze and Guattari, but actually just in terms of post-structuralism more generally, even thinking with people like Derrida and so on. So I think that, with Todd May actually starting that whole trajectory in some ways, and Saul Newman was, of course, a central figure. I think in some ways Thomas Nail has maybe sort of continued that in some way in his work on revolution, returning to revolution and Zapatismo. But yeah, I do think it's sort of disappeared. It's actually a pity for me because I think there's a lot more to uncover.
I was going to briefly say that I think actually reading Anti-Oedipus for the first time has made me feel like more Marxist than before, honestly, which I think is kind of ironic. I don't think most people don't think that, you know what I mean? The hardcore Marxists are like, oh, that's, whatever, and the vice versa, right?
Yeah, the Marxists and the analysts probably both look at Anti-Oedipus and say, no, thank you.
I mean, the thing is that I think even anarchists you sort of can't help have a sort of close affinity to Marxism in some way, right? You sort of love to hate it. You also, but you also love some of it. And of course, his ideas came from a milieu. I think that's the thing that people sometimes forget. There's such a great film at the moment. I think it's called, but it just shows how diffuse anarchism was in society. It was just one of those things, And so, Proudhon, Kropotkin, Bakunin, Marx, they were all thinking about these ideas. And Marx just was the one to kind of synthesize them in a very specific way, and of course he went off Marxism went off in a specific way. But I think that there are a lot of affinities, and it continues to be a kind of interesting tension between anarchism and Marxism, and maybe Deleuze and Guattari for that reason.
Very true, right? Taylor, something you might find interesting about Kropotkin is that he was like a naturalist, sort of. He was interested in evolution. He was sort of I think he was a prince, and he abdicated his princehood and like studied science, etc. So I feel like even digging into Kropotkin, he might have some like affinity with Guattari's interest in, ethology.
Right.
I want to say that even Kropotkin might have even had some relationship to ethology specifically, but
doesn't he have a book on
while.
Ecology? Not ethology, but on ecology. Doesn't he have a book on ecology? Am I wrong? Chantelle, maybe you know.
I'd have to look.
Well, the thing that he does write, he writes that little piece on mutual aid, which really is kind of looking at evolutionary biology and thinking about, how these Darwinian ideas and even ideas of social Darwinianism, that kind of teleology is wrong. The idea of, this kind of strong idea of competition is really wrong. And what natural selection really is tied to is cooperation and mutual aid. And so he actually talks about that. This is quite long ago. So it's in very interesting ways that he's thinking about these ideas in what I think is quite a sophisticated way, challenging these notions that are sort of floating around at that time, and which, of course, has been recuperated by capitalism in a very specific way and continues to kind of be part of the social imaginary.
I was going to say, before we get started with the leading question, which we always love to ask, I just think that it's nice if there was a moment when there was this burst of post-anarchist literature coming out. It is nice, though, that, your volume on Deleuze After Anarchism, which you co-edited, I assume with one of your friends, you seem to have an affinity with his work. I forget his name. You can name him for me.
Yes, Aragon.
Okay.
Aragon Ilov. Yeah.
And Wonderful name, by the way. As a fantasy nerd myself, I can't help but think of, but also Deleuze and Guattari after anarchism, or anarchism after Deleuze and Guattari. Let me get that right. Which I also want to ask about the title because you mention it in the book. But first, Coop, I know you like to lead in with this question. Yeah. I'll let you take over.
Something we like to start the conversations out with as kind of a warm-up is to just get a sense of we call it philosophical origin story, as if you were some kind of perhaps superhero, but it can be really whatever direction you want to take it in. I was kind of telling you a bit about my background and how that sort of led me here. So, feel free to, if there's a singular moment, a book, a thinker, something that just really grabbed you and sort of gave you that passion for philosophy. And then if you feel like extending that to Deleuze and Guattari, that'd be great. We'd love to hear, whatever you would like to share.
Or anarchism.
Oh, right.
Or anarchism.
That works just as well.
So my origin story is a little bit promiscuous.
Oh, great. We like that.
So I actually started off in art.
Okay.
I studied fine art. And then I come from sort of a slightly poorer, lower middle class, I would say. So my parents didn't really have money to send me to college or to university. And so I did this first year. I made a lot of debt. And then I sort of realized I have to move on. I have to do something else. So I did a lot of jobs, just odd jobs. And then I landed this job at the library at the University of South Africa. And that sort of allowed me they're a distance institution, and it allowed me to start studying again. So I studied at night and I studied everything. I didn't realize how much there was. So I was just interested in everything. I went from sort of criminology to psychology to English, and I was just all over the place. And then I kind of started studying analytic philosophy because that's what they had. And I really got interested in philosophy of mind. And I was reading, sort of Dennett and Hofstadter and Charmer, the big guys, Clark and so on. So I liked philosophy of mind, but the rest didn't really I didn't hit it off with philosophy at that point. So I was also I kind of drifted into linguistics and English and political science. And then while I was doing my English studies, I discovered the continental philosophers. So Derrida and Foucault were really big in South Africa. I think Derrida even came to visit South Africa somewhere in the 90s. So there was something, you sort of couldn't miss it. But I guess then I started, because I was in cognitive linguistics, I started reading Barthes and Christopher, sort of the more structuralist kind of thought at that point. Then discovered the other woman, Irigaray, Sixou, and something started happening for me where I was like, oh, I like this, But there wasn't really a place to study it for me in my undergrad studies. So I just continued reading. I finished my degree. I continued reading. I did my MA actually in cognitive linguistics and continued talking about Christopher, and kind of thought about her, her stuff on intertextuality that really interests me. And then I sort of became very disillusioned with linguistics, but I didn't know why. I couldn't explain to myself why. Something about it frustrated me. And then I left academia for a year and a half, because I just was working all these different jobs, just wherever I could find in very many different fields. And I opened a vegan restaurant, which was a very big mistake.
Oh.
During that time, I discovered anarchism and Deleuze and Guattari. And so I started reading, and I really wanted to return to academia, but I didn't have money. So I started applying for grants. And then I got really lucky, and I got this 3-year grant to do my PhD full time. And so then I just kind of gave myself over to Deleuze and Guattari. I fell into the cauldron. I drank the Kool-Aid.
The witch's broom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened. So even though my PhD has quite a funny title, it's a PhD on Deleuze and Guattari and translation.
Yeah, I noticed you had done some work on that. Do you want to say anything about that? Because I'm obviously very interested.
So this is, again, I get I get bored with stuff quite quickly. So
That's
I
fair. That's
just,
fair.
so I was kind of in translation. I'm very fascinated by translation, especially literary translations, and how different translations of the same book can be so different and
Right.
just spark something different. So I was thinking about that, and I couldn't find a theory that matched what I was thinking. And then, of course, I read Deleuze and Guattari's chapter on linguistics.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, they're saying that thing that I couldn't say to myself.
Right.
Here it is. And so I started understanding something about the order word and these incorporeal transformations, which even you can think of translation as a kind of incorporeal transformation, right? In this kind of strange sense. But I started thinking about a more nomadic kind of translation, especially taking into consideration my context. We have 11 official languages. How do you grapple with this? How do you keep the singularity of a book in the translation without, especially when you're translating into a language like English, which is kind of hegemonic in its own way, right?
The majoritarian, yeah.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I love English. It's, there's so much for me in it. So despite its like strange hegemonic majoritarian existence. But I think that's again Deleuze, when you start talking about Proust and the kind of, and Kafka with Guattari and kind of minor languages. So that's kind of where that went. And once I started thinking about that stuff, I actually realized, philosophy is what I love, because I'd just been reading more and more philosophy. I also fell in love with Foucault a little bit before that. And then I started just reading everything I could find, and kind of went a little bit down the French trajectory because, you can't help it. And I wanted to read everything that Deleuze and Guattari read. So there wasn't much Simondon, as you know, until recently, but I just read whatever I could find. I read some of the biology stuff that they drew on, and just all the sort of secondary resources. And then I just also started reading a whole lot of other philosophy around that, going back a little bit to Bachelard, Canguilhem, and moving forward a little bit. And so that's really how I ended up with Deleuze and Guattari. And I think I spent a lot of time, because their oeuvres together and separately are so large. I think you can just be a Deleuzean for life or a Guattarian for life because there's so much, right? There's so much there. I must say, I'm a little bit at the point where I don't ever want to read Anti-Oedipus or Difference in Repetition or 1,000 Plateaus again.
Yeah, I understand that.
I love those texts, but I also feel like I've read them so many times that sometimes I'm just like, oh, I can't face it anymore. I taught a class on difference in repetition last year, and I really had to sort of psych myself up. But I kind of went into the science part more, into the maths and all of that. And so that became very interesting for me again. So that's what I mean. You can just continue finding new things.
I'd be interested to hear did you engage with much Peirce? I just have kind of a interest in Peirce because I think I'm obsessed with Dune. So I have this idea of like applying a lot of anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus, etc. type material to the work. And I think Peirce in particular might be something because of I think there's something there to chase up. So I'd just be curious.
Well, the semiotics, right? That would be
semiotics. So I engaged a little bit with Peirce while I was reading Deleuze and Guattari, especially to understand, what they meant, the difference between semiotics and linguistics, when they start talking about those differences. But I must say that at that point, I just didn't want to do anything related to language and linguistics anymore. So I kind of read it, and I like the idea of semiology and semiosis and all of that, that you can play with. That for me starts getting really interesting. And I recently read a sci-fi novel called Semiosis. I don't know if you've read it, but
interesting.
Yeah, it's really good. It's kind of about bamboo communicating. in this kind of very strange way with people. So it's
Hmm.
really, really interesting. And I guess, that did spark a little bit of interest again in this kind of line of thinking. But I'd really be interested to hear how you're linking this to Dune.
For Pierce, I'm not sure quite yet, but I think there's a lot of, even in A Thousand Plateaus, for example, they cite the novel Children of Dune in the nomadology chapter, referencing it's like because in the desert on Arrakis, on the planet, you have to avoid walking with rhythm or you'll attract one of these giant sandworms. The sandworms respond to, I don't know, they have some type of sonar sense or whatever. So there's something there also with regard to sort of the way that the Fremen people who are kind of the quasi-indigenous inhabitants of the planet, they hide their numbers. There's never been a census of them. So they're like, there's something about, escaping, obviously the nomadology, the nomad aspect of it, but also that, what is it? Evading capture, what's the other one I'm blanking on?
Well, there's something interesting even with rhythm and the refrain there.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Perhaps an asignification tie there too with the walk, with the walking. It's not really because it's a semi-feudalist society too, like a lot of the understanding the barbarian, territory or the barbarian territorial machines, etc. All of that, the war machine, etc. Like that's kind of baked in there because you kind of have this colonial power. The Atreides come to, and they sort of graft onto this mythology that's been laying down, this kind of colonial myth of this outside male that's going to be their messiah, etc. And so they kind of utilize that and to sort of for their own ends ultimately. So there's just a lot of, it's an interesting way to kind of look at these ideas.
Yeah.
I think.
There's
I don't know if that helps.
Definitely a book in there, I think.
Oh yeah, I just have to read some Pierce and as well as some more. Gosh, I'm blanking on. Bergson. I think Bergson in particular because of the time element and the sort of prescient vision. I mean, even perhaps dogmatic image of thought in the way that these particular visions of the future become its own self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. Taylor's rolling his eyes.
No. I just think that, what's interesting is you could spend a lifetime reading Peirce, right? There's like 100,000 pages of him. But at the very least, Guattari draws upon his work to try to elaborate a semiotics that wouldn't privilege language. Perhaps like he wants to say, Bard and semiology is really a kind of linguistics-based study of signs, whereas Peirce gives us this semiotics that's more, you could say machinic or asignifying, et cetera. It doesn't privilege language as the front runner or as encompassing everything of signs. And I think that's why, too, you see them privileging someone like Hjelmslev, and anti-oedipus on over Saussure and et cetera. So there's all of that. In any case, this is great that we opened a can of sandworms to get us started. I guess we could go anywhere here. I was definitely struck by a number of things in your origin story. I looked at your essay, which I assume may have spawned from your work on your dissertation. I was really struck by this kind of opening question of, can there be a translation that isn't reduced to a kind of mechanical redundancy and transformation of redundancies, but has the aspects of a kind of creative, transformative, machinic repetition? I know that's not why we have you on today, but I just wanted to say I was fascinated because I am very much thinking, in terms of as a translator myself, I was definitely kind of looking at that and saying, oh, okay, that's fascinating. And, I do think that there is something to that because, the kind of translation I do with philosophy can be very much more straightforward. But on the other hand, it may not be Proust or something as elaborate as that. But on the other hand, there is this sense in which, I like to think that I try to bring a little bit of a poetic sensibility because sometimes as translators, we may focus more on the content and say, I want to get the ideas first. But then, you also need to have that aspect of where you're trying to ask yourself, how would this sound in English? And so you need to have a kind of holistic take where you're also thinking of the formalization of the ideas. Otherwise, they don't go and you lose some of that magic, if you will. You lose some of that that impact. I mean, I think I forget the author you discuss at the start of your essay, but you kind of say you were struck by reading it in the original, and then you got a copy of the translation, and it just kind of lost a certain enchantment to it.
Yes, and so that's Afrikaans, which is sort of my second language. I don't really speak it, but I read it well, and it's very close to Dutch, right? In fact, if you can read Afrikaans, you can read Dutch, and vice versa. They're very close. So already it is quite difficult for me to read literary Afrikaans. Well, it's quite poetic, but Afrikaans is a very interesting. It's quite a guttural language in some ways. It kind of mobilizes sound in a very specific way, which makes it sometimes funny, sometimes poetic. It really mobilizes, I would say, motion through kind of sound. And so English doesn't do that very well in that way, in quite that way. You know, you have these guttural sounds in Afrikaans, like, and, you know, I can't even do the R. It's an R that I can't pronounce. It really has this, like, it's got impact. And I think that was the thing for me that was so interesting about then reading the English. And what actually started me on the project was reading Murakami. You know, there's that one short story that's translated by one translator, and that becomes the first chapter of, I think, a Hard-Boiled Wonderland or one of those, and it's translated by somebody else. And it's just so different. And so that was sort of what started me thinking around this, you know. And Hofstadter also has that wonderful book on Mamignon, you know, the little poem that he writes. And that whole book is about this poem. And he makes his students kind of translate it, and it has these rules. And so there's something so interesting. It's really interested me for a long time. Just, you know, translation is so fascinating. And when you read translation theory, you know, it's the same old stuff. Like, okay, you know, you kind of have to measure meaning with, you know, reading or readability. And, you know, it's so kind of stuffy for me, you know. And then, of course, you have to take into consideration culture and, you know, all these things. And they're important. All of these aspects are important. I'm not actually trying to diss them in any way. But I wanted something, I guess, a little bit more nomadic, if we're going to use a word here, you know, a kind of nomadic translation praxis. What does that look like? You know, what does it mean to mobilize? You know, if you think about sort of, you know, translating Simondon, for example, and mobilizing those concepts in a way that captures what he does in the French in some way, just mobilizes them. And so for me, that's the kind of thing that I was thinking about. And I've also done a little bit of translation. So I have grappled with that, like, okay, how do you say this? And, you know, what would be the best way of doing this? And of course, it's different whether, you know, if you're doing philosophy, it has its own thing. When you're doing literature, it's got its own thing. If you're translating an advertisement, it's a very different. You know, I think that's the thing that started fascinating me, is just, this is the thing, how to not reproduce a kind of order word. So that was the thing that I was thinking with sort of mechanical reproduction versus machinic repetition.
It's interesting, right? Because there's a sense in which on an ordinary everyday level, we might think of the notion of machinic as referring to a machine translation, when in fact that would be much closer to the mechanical, where you really just kind of have an input and an output that can perhaps get the job done in a pinch, especially if you're trying to maybe translate, you know, a sign or an order word. But in order to make things pass and to give it a certain lived experience or something like this, you've got to tap into something else. But in any case, I feel like I apologize to both of you. I feel like I've hijacked this away from the focus, but maybe there's a way there's something that can maybe deepen our discussion of your
I think this is good, because the order words or something. I mean, I've not as read up on Deleuze and Guattari as either of you, so this kind of definitely is good for me to talk about the order words at the very least. I know I didn't really preface a question there, but I just wanted to interject.
I think I do talk about the order words somewhere in the book. So
yes,
you do,
it's
exactly.
in
That's
there.
what exactly.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
it's kind of linked, it's even kind of linked to the dogmatic image of thought, to kind of axiomatic thinking, if you want to call it that. And, what is that thing that Deleuze and Guattari say so well? They say, well, it's not, what is it transferring? It's transferring a kind of a literal order. It's telling you what to do rather than communicating something other than that. It's not communicating different content other than, this is how you should behave. It's kind of Foucauldian in that sense. But I think that's the thing that really interests me about the order word, is also how they link it to the incorporeal transformation, because I think that's where, the real power lies, is, when the judge says you're guilty, in that moment, you change from one thing to another irrevocably, right? I always think about this, when they tap you on the head and you get your doctorate, and suddenly you're a doctor,
Right.
so and so. Comes with a certain kind of prestige and whatever, and what I find interesting, this is interesting for me because as someone who is quite tattooed and I have piercings, and I have a lot less piercings now than I used to have. I had quite a lot of, I think 11 at some point in on my face. So it's quite out there. And for me, what has always been interesting is, you get treated a certain way, people treat you a certain way, and then they see professor or
Right.
doctor in front of your name, and it changes.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I love this.
so-
I love to subvert expectations in this way. So
But keep going, please.
please, sorry.
But that's the thing, right? It's that expectation. That's what the order word does. It
Right.
creates a specific expectation around a specific context. In that sense, it's very much like, I would say, like the dogmatic image of thought, is that it sets out the possibility for action or for thought in advance. So I think that's really quite interesting for me. And, when you start thinking about what happens at school, at least in my school, the way teachers speak to you or treat you, or all of that is really just communicating order words. And for me, it's very closely tied to sort of discipline in Foucault's sense. So I think there's something there, a kind of affinity between order words and discipline. There's something very closely related there, because it does the same thing. You also internalize order words. It's something that's not just communicated, but that's internalized and then acted out and reproduced. And that's that thing, with Deleuze and Guattari talk about. These are two concepts that really interest me. My next big book is going to be on redundancy.
Yeah, excellent.
So this is the thing, Deleuze says in the beginning of Difference and Repetition that you never know you never know quite what you're going to become obsessed with, basically. But this notion of redundancy is basically that for me. I find it so interesting. And it occurs, they use it so many times in 1,000 Plateaus. I've been thinking about it more and more, is like, what does that redundancy do and mean? And of course, it is very closely related to resonance. But, redundancy, again, it doesn't have valence, because a refrain is a redundancy, right? And it can be positive or negative, depending on whether it allows for experimentation or not. So redundancy is this kind of very mutable concept, and they use it in both senses. They use it more negatively, actually, more than what they use it positively when they talk about it in 1,000 Plateaus. But when you start thinking about, for example, how the state form resonates itself through religion, in the family, in schools, and so on, and that reproduction is the redundancy. So the state becomes redundant. It doesn't have to work so hard. There's something about the state that becomes redundant because it's already auto-produced in all these other ways. And so I think that really interests me. How does this work? And I think there's, for me now, thinking about information, I think a lot more about information and sort of algorithmic societies and that kind of thing. And I think it's so closely linked to that too, because recursion creates a kind of redundancy in so many spheres, I think I've gone off topic now, but
Oh no, that's
that's
good. That's
No,
good.
but
This,
kind of
this makes me
that
think of
idea of redundancy is very much, that's kind of why I think I talked about the dogmatic image of thought for such a long time in the book. I take up quite a lot of space to discuss it. In some ways, when I was doing that, I was like, oh, haven't too many people written about this? And shouldn't I just leave this out? Because I don't just want to repeat what other people have said. But I just thought that there was something in the way that it's related to the state and to capitalism, and even then to algorithmic societies, which I wanted to bring back into discussion, because I think it's a really powerful, I like chapters 4 and 5 in Difference and Repetition. Those are really my favorites. But I think chapter 3 is that pivot, it is that pivot chapter. And it is so important because it brings together almost Deleuze's entire project. He sort of encapsulates something about what he does in his own work, which is to lay bare the redundancy and then mobilize it in a new way. And he does it with thinkers, he does it with concepts, and then later he does something new with Guattari. But they continue that in some way. So I guess that was the kind of focal point that I wanted to bring back, especially thinking about why it's so difficult, I think, even sometimes for anarchists, to think about what the world might look like outside of the state and capitalism. And especially, because I think it's kind of moved on even from neoliberalism. I think we're in what we can call really an algorithmic stage of capitalism. So there's something, not that neoliberalism has disappeared, but I think there's a new kind of dimension that is taking place. So I think that's really something that interests me, is why is it so difficult? We know it's difficult to think outside of your own little conceptual box until you read something. And I remember I had this with Deleuze and Guattari, where I was just like, my brain was blown, And then I didn't have it for a long time until I read Simondon, really. And I was like, what is this? And I read the technical one first, and I was just like, what is this guy saying? This is like something is happening here. And I've had that with Stegler, and also I'm now starting to grapple with Laruelle. So I think
my gosh,
there's something similar happening there, which is just, it's so nice when you almost see the limits of your own imagination, when suddenly it's exposed to you and you're like, oh my God, this is how I've been thinking all this time. And there's a whole other way of thinking, but I just couldn't see it.
That's such a great way to describe it, I think.
I'm glad that you brought up redundancy. I am glad that you've continued your origin story to kind of the mid game, and you're talking about your development. You've even looked forward to your next work, which is always something that we try to end with. So that's something we can come back to.
Recursiveness.
Yeah, that's exactly. But there is something about it, right? Where, they even define redundancy in terms of the sign is redundant with the sign, kind of ad infinitum. But I like that you brought it up and linked it to the dogmatic image of thought. And, there is something too about how when Deleuze is looking back at his solo work, if you will, and I think he does himself a disservice, but he humbly says, if there's something in what I wrote before this assemblage with Guattari that I would preserve and say I did something good, it would be the image of thought chapter, right? And I do think that you're right. There's this pivot in Difference and Repetition, but in fact, against thinkers like Badiou and others who want to say Deleuze is an apolitical thinker, which there is a semblance of that before the work with Guattari. The image of thought chapter has such a political valence, and it gives us some of the tools to elaborate what you take up as statist realism. And I like that your footnote kind of points out, and I may be butchering her name, so I'm going to be generous. Anurada Dingwani Needham has apparently coins this term, statist realism, which you take for yourself and repurpose, which is part of how concepts work. But it seems like her usage of it, or coinage, is related to a kind of cinematic notion where we are, I suppose, situated in a way in which we are sort of viewing things like a state, or like these states, if you will, that we're supposed to resonate with. And you take this and generalize it and kind of universalize it to describe the ways in which, whether we attribute this to Zizek or Jameson, right, where it's easier to imagine the end of the world and the end of capitalism. And that's part and parcel with our kind of, you could say it's easier to imagine a sort of, I suppose, an apocalyptic vision than the downfall of the state form. So there's something about taking the state as a model, which is sometimes how Deleuze and Guattari talk about it, that you forefront in your work, and you want to call that into question. So I wanted to say all of that to allow you maybe a space to describe what went into you taking up this term, reprising it, statist realism.
When I was grappling with this, I did mention this to you before, but I'm just going to, I just had hip surgery. And so I was very stationary. I was very stuck in a chair, and I had to kind of learn to walk again. And I was in a lot of pain. I think that's why I started writing about care a lot in the end. But as I was thinking about it, so I really struggled. I actually struggled with this chapter. And I think because it was right in the beginning, and I was really still quite in a lot of pain, and I just couldn't bring it together. So I was thinking about the state and the state form, and, what can I say that anarchists and Deleuze and Guattari haven't said, because it's so difficult, bringing together these large bodies of work. A lot of work has been done on this. A lot of work has been done on the state and capitalism. It could be redundant itself.
It's saturated, right?
I was kind of just struggling, and I went onto my computer a little bit, and I started sort of surfing my own books, my book collection, and I came across the Mark Fisher again. And of course, he writes the book on capitalist realism. He's the first one to kind of think about, how can't get out of a certain mode of living and thinking. And so he really thinks about this in terms of capitalism. And then I was like, oh my God, there's like statist realism, and it's something different. It's not quite the same. And why hasn't anyone used this? So I started looking up, does this term exist? Because I was kind of excited. And then I found this one reference to it, but it didn't really describe what I wanted to describe. And actually, Dan McQuillan has now coined AI realism, and I'm a little bit jealous of that. Capitalism does a specific thing, and Mark Fisher really describes it well. But I think for me, that's really what I started thinking about the state. Everything I had read led to this idea of thinking about the foreclosure of any kind of thought, of any other kind of socio-political arrangement. Why can't we think outside the state? And when you say this to people, this is sort of one of the things I hear the most, when I talk about anarchism and so on, but it can't work at large scales. It's impossible. Well, we have Rojava, and we also have the Zapatistas as very good examples of how it might work at quite large scales, right? So there are actually examples of people who have just broken out of this. But I think it really is difficult because, again, and I think it's again that redundancy, the state form is also our form of thought.
Yeah.
And it's also how we grow up in schools, it's how we're schooled, it's part of the nuclear family. All of those little enclosures reproduce the state form. And so I think, that's why people can't often think about other family or familial arrangements, because it's just so ingrained. And it's not how we lived all this time. People had many different ways of living. There have been lots of different kinds of experiments with socio-political organization. And I think this really points also to the violence of the state and the axiomatics of the state, right? That kind of violent takeover of the way we live, the way we think, and the mechanisms that are used to keep that in place. And there are so many, bureaucratization. It is difficult. And I think also to be experimental, and Deleuze and Guattari even say this, they say this so nicely in the refrain chapter. And Guattari says this somewhere else in a nicer way. He says, you have to have a little piece of fresh grass in your pocket. I love that. There has to be a little bit of home in order for you to be able to experiment. If there's not a little bit of security, you can't actually go out and experiment because you're more focused on security. And so we live in a very precarious kind of world. Work is very precarious, for example. And, why would you protest against bad working conditions if you're scared you're going to lose your job or your contract, or you won't get another contract, or you won't get your contract renewed, or any of these things? So precarity, I think, now plays, whereas violence used to play quite a big role, during the sort of more imperial time, then colonization and so on. It's now become far more subtle. And I think precarity is one of the ways in which the state reproduces itself in its kind of current form. So I think it's, and if we think about the state and kind of the resources that go into upholding state formations, nations, really just like sort of, if you think about military spending, which everything just is geared towards protecting this idea of the state and the nation. And of course, the way we talk about migrants and so on reinforces that again. Xenophobia reinforces that again. I think that those mechanisms sort of resonance are so sophisticated. And it's not because people are dumb or because they can't, or because they're lazy, that they can't think outside of the state form. It's because it's so infused and diffused all around us. And so you have to almost start unpacking, you have to unpack so many things, including in your own thought. And it's a kind of continuous process. And I think that for me is really, what statist realism is. And it's a kind of, if we talk about desire, the way Deleuze and Guattari would, it's a kind of desire for a transcendent form. It's a desire for a kind of security. But of course, that desire is created by the state. It's not there before, despite, the social contract and all of those theories. It didn't exist before. It was created by the state. And so that's, Deleuze and Guattari talk about the originary violence of the state in 1,000 Plateaus, when they move a little bit on from anti-oedipus.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting. I think when we had John Pertevi on, one of the things that I really enjoyed discussing was this notion, Kant talks about the originary violence of the state, but he kind of makes it secondary de facto, because if you look a little bit too hard at the founding violence of the state, whereupon it gets its authority, then you start to get a little bit of unrest, and you start to kind of think in a certain way where it becomes contingent and not necessary. And so it leads a little too quickly to saying, well, that's a strange presupposition. Maybe it should be done away with. And then you end up with things like the terror, right? Which has to be, the terror with a capital T, right? That has to be warded off. So there is this interesting aspect where, and obviously this is something too that's been written about a lot. So it is interesting that there is kind of in this presupposition, it's like, don't look backward too much. Otherwise you might call into question the dogmatic image of thought, the sort of state model as a noological model or way of thinking. And I guess the last thing I'll say before sort of throwing it back to you or Coop is this notion that there's something interesting where it's almost an aside, but Deleuze also qualifies the dogmatic image of thought as an orthodox or moral image of thought. And so there's something about how the state form or statist realism also sort of, we could talk about it in terms of order words or a whole framework of order words, where it imposes a kind of morality of, say, good sense, common sense, of the good nature of thinking. And it kind of presupposes an orthodoxy that is, in a certain sense, the foreclosure of any sort of experimentation, because that already seems to be kind of built into these other forms. Like, I'm just thinking about when I was growing up, and I think, Coop and I share a similar type of religious upbringing where even to kind of call into question certain theological principles, whether it be the existence of God or the role of sin, blah, blah, blah. There's always already this thread of heresy, of blasphemy that presupposes even kind of questioning the conceptual framework within which a worldview is supposedly situated is itself inherently sinful or asocial, anarchistic, something like this. This moral dimension has always kind of struck me, and sometimes it can be lost, but it's part and parcel of the dogma.
I don't know if you remember many years ago, but many, but sort of maybe the 90s, Susan Blackmore, who was really interested in kind of sort of paranormal psychology, and she did a sort of 180, and she just started realizing that, hold on, there's a very interesting way in which like religion works, for example. And she wrote that little book called The Meme Machine, long before internet memes, right? Or quite a while before internet memes became what it is now. So it's sort of closely related to, what's his name? The blind watchmaker, Dawkins. It's closer
Richard
to
Dawkins.
his idea. Yeah, it's closer to his idea of the meme. But he sort of starts talking about all these hooks, like exactly that. Like you can't question it because, already questioning it is kind of sinful. So already you have this like problem. And as you say, so the state does that the same. There are these almost conceptual hooks that keep bringing you back. That's quite interesting for me, because I think it's those hooks that are so difficult to kind of get rid of. Is like you can't even see them half the time, unless you've like really grappled with something. And as you know, grappling with something like religion to get out of it can be really existentially kind of threatening. And I think this is something to understand about the dogmatic image of thought, is that to get rid of it, you kind of have to already from the beginning be okay with a little bit of existential uncertainty, because it definitely, it pushes your boundaries. That's the thing. It will push your boundaries. It will push your buttons. And so you have to kind of stick with that existential uncertainty and say, okay, I'm going to just see where this takes me.
I think that what's interesting, you brought up that really nice quote from Guattari, a little bit of grass, a little bit of home. And what's so insidious is that the state form or statist realism, this presupposition of the kind of state as the conditions of possibility for what is thinkable, that can so easily be the substitute for that little bit of home. And so we have to be able to distinguish between that kind of pre-given solution, if you will, or model of thinking, this upright model, this good-natured model of thinking. And we have to be able to see that as a kind of a false friend, if you will. And I think that this is why, too, you bring out throughout the work this notion that it's precisely, whether we call it problematics or something like this, this precisely the role of being able to determine problems and solutions and not accept them as pre-given that constitutes the little bit of freedom we have to be able to maneuver and experiment. Being able to determine, I think this is too why I always come back to this, but he's, as opposed to kind of culmination of absolute knowledge, Deleuze is trying to elaborate an understanding of what true veritable learning looks like. And learning occurs not by sort of accepting problems as already given, because to a certain extent, that just reproduces the same model of recognition, of identity, et cetera, that constitute the four walls of the dogmatic image.
Absolutely. I think that's quite a nice way of saying it. I like the idea of the false sense of home.
In the notes, this was an important, I think you would probably agree with this notion of, if we're going to include, well, I guess this comes about with the title. You kind of mention in your book that anarchism after Deleuze and Guattari is perhaps not necessarily how you might title your work. It kind of comes along in a series. And so I would ask two things. One, how do we understand the after? Because it doesn't necessarily have to be a simple temporal linear thing, but there could be something about what does, the after could be a dynamic thing where it's still not yet done. What does anarchism look like in the wake of Deleuze and Guattari, in communication with Deleuze and Guattari? And then the second thing I would want to give you the chance, because I think you do set this up in some of your recurring questions about, for example, whether or not this world is still worth fighting for in the face of so many looming disastrous calamities. You subtitle your work Fabulating Futures, and that subtitle, which is deceivingly simplistic, begs for a kind of unpacking and calls one to think sort of what could that entail. So I want to give you maybe a little bit just to talk about the title of the work, because I do think that within it, you perhaps can have so much leeway to unravel some of the threads that run throughout.
Yeah, so I think that after is really interesting because it really irritated me in the beginning.
Okay. Okay, yeah.
And then, but I did kind of start thinking about what if there is a way of thinking about after in an interesting way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, of course, anarchism comes way before Deleuze and Guattari. They don't really engage with anarchism in any real way, except through, I'm going to say this wrong, so Clastres' work, is that how you say it?
Pierre Clastres,
Yeah. He's interesting because he is an anarchist. He is the one kind of real point where they clearly must have kind of grappled with it a little bit, if not explicitly so.
Yeah.
And they use the word anarchy, or anarchism, both in anarchic and all of that, in positive and negative ways in their sort of oeuvres. It's all over the place. So what does it mean to think about Deleuze and Guattari, or rather anarchism after Deleuze and Guattari? And I think that there is something interesting because for me, at any rate, I think we talked a little bit beforehand about the kind of post-anarchist bubble that there was. And one of the things that is interesting for me is that it did bringing post-structuralism into contact with anarchism and the other way around really did something for both of them. I think in terms of anarchism, I think the kind of theoretical backing of Deleuze and Guattari is for me, well, that's maybe just because I'm really into theory and I kind of like systematic thinking, but I really like the kind of philosophical depth that it brought for me to my own thinking around anarchism. And at the same time, it radicalizes Deleuze and Guattari even a bit more. Because I think, for me, at any rate, their political project is radical. It really, even something like schizoanalysis is radical. It's not some social democratic kind of, idea of life and what life could be. Because that's the question they ask, isn't it? When they're thinking about desire or any of these other things, they're asking, how can we live the most intensive kind of life without either kind of succumbing to a line of death or, deterritorializing too fast, so having the kind of intensity eat us up, or not have a life of intensity at all. So how do we mobilize intensity, both in the kind of pre-individual and sort of more actualized, not that these things are separate, the virtual and we only think the virtual, it's not separate from life. So I quite like this idea of that's the question they're grappling with, is how do we live a life of intensity, especially given that we live in these statist capitalist societies that want to kind of dilute our desire. And so this is the thing that I started thinking, okay, and this is where Fabulating Futures come from, because I had a very different project in mind. I think my project ended up being a little bit more hopeful than I thought it would be. I tend to be quite misanthropic, and I think you can actually see that in some of my work. But as I was writing this, I was thinking, what is it that Deleuze and Guattari and anarchism gave me? Because that's the thing I want to communicate. And what it gave to me is not only a kind of radicalization of my own thought, but as someone who is quite misanthropic, they gave me a kind of way of both of these things, or there are three really, of thinking about life in a more generative way. And so I first wanted to have the subtitle. I had to fight for the subtitle a little bit, but I wanted to have it Folding Cosmologies. And I still like that. And I think I still want to do something with it.
Mhm.
But as I started working through this, I just thought, actually what I'm thinking about is the future. I'm
Mhm.
thinking about this lack of future that we're all feeling because of climate change and, the kinds of problems we're dealing with in societies, the disintegration of society and so on. There's a sense of the future being something that is not really available to us anymore, or available only for a short time, like the world will, even the UN says like we have 10 years or whatever, so there's that idea of like this apocalyptic doom. And so I wanted to really take that. And here I think is where that idea of believing in this world, because as I was reading through the literature again, I just found them repeating this sentence, like in different ways, in conversations with Claire Parnay and just in letters and so on. This idea of belief in this world repeats. And then I also found it in Stigler. Stigler, in one of his books, I think it's in one of the Disbelief and Discredit books. I might be lying, so somebody should check this, but I think it's in there. So I think it's there that he says, he picks up on that too. And he says, he agrees with Deleuze that we need to find reasons to believe in this world. It just resonated with me because even when I look at my students, I just see a kind of hopelessness, just a kind of apathy, a kind of like, whatever, does it matter? Even one of my students last year, I think we were talking about gender or race or something like that in class. And somehow we were thinking about kind of changing how we live. And somebody even said to me, they put up their hands and they were like, but why should we? Because is there a future for us? Is it worth thinking about changing all these things, which, are great? They weren't against it. They thought it was, great to think about it. But they were just like, what's the point? Where are we going? And I guess that's where I love that. There's that Bifo Baradi quote, where he kind of says, why do we do these things? And he says, well, we have to act as if there is a possibility that we can change capitalist societies, as if there is a possibility that we can create a different way of living that does not rely on the state. Well, he doesn't say that, but he talks about that as if. And that for me was it was so profound when I sort of reread that. I just thought, because that's it's a self-validating action. So even when you think about how Deleuze talks and Guattari talk about inscription in anti-oedipus, where they start talking about territorial inscription and imperial inscription and so on, and they talk about codes before overcoding, codes being self-validating. And so there's a sense of agency in that, right? You're doing it because you believe it's worth doing. And I think for me, it's not because somebody tells you, which is so much of what we do, because somebody tells me. No, it's because I believe it's the ethical thing to do and it's worth doing for that reason. And I think that for me started connecting something. How do we get out of this reflexive impotence that is kind of statist realism or capitalist realism or AI realism or whatever you want to call it? How do we get away from that and start thinking about what it means to fabulate futures in the here and now? And I guess that then became a kind of driving idea. I think it is actually, you see it sort of from the beginning of the book to the end. It's a kind of theme or a refrain for me.
This is really good. And that's why when I was sort of reading through and why I told you before we started, I kind of revisited one of the series in Logic of Sense, the series on the event. And it's there. Well, it's not the only place, but it's one of the places where he describes the sort of activity of counter actualization, because it's sort of there that we have some of this discussion about sort of ways of, I think, thinking about the present in such a way that the past and the future can have an indefinite impact. And so part of, not to belabor the point or become exegetical and try to unpack the concept itself, because that would be a whole episode, but it's more, to me, what I was struck with about how some of this talk about counter-actualization sort of goes with his whole notion of this kind of ethics of the event, which is, not to be unworthy of what happens to us. But it also is about ways of thinking in the present, but outside of its constraints, which I think is part and parcel of this kind of thinking outside of the dogmatic image of thought, but perhaps having effects on it, perhaps sort of dismantling it from within, even if we're sort of always already sort of caught within, for example, writing books or using words as we are here. We're sort of mobilizing representation, but in a way against itself. And so there's something about, within the present, but not constrained by it, and sort of working with and in it, but sort of undermining it from within. And I think that that's part of what I was perhaps also getting from this notion of fabulating futures, because yes, we have to do it in the here and now, but it is also with enough sort of potential to mobilize that metastability that can transform the present from within, sort of against it. And I think that that's what got me thinking a little bit. That was something that I kind of took away from it, because otherwise, yes, we are, if we merely sort of think of the states of affairs of the present, things can look very bleak, but that's just one aspect, and it may feel overwhelming, but as you were kind of saying earlier, you need a little bit of that anxiety that can, as Simondon kind of works it out, anxiety is this movement where we are faced with the possibility of the here and now being transformable or substitutable for an infinity of other heres and now. And the problem, I think, with Simondon is that anxiety can lead us to want to try to make these trans-individual transformations on our own, as though kind of in a Heideggerian way, where like the death that confronts us, our being toward death, is very much mine. But in a certain sense, Simondon wants to show that no, there is a sense in which anxiety can lead to a defeatist stance, and we can think that we can create these becomings and transformations just on our own. But when it's linked back up, and when that potential is linked back up to the larger collective activity of individuation via trans-individuation, there is this possibility of mobilizing other heres and now. And I think that that's part of the tension and the struggle, I think, perhaps is what I got out of your subtitle.
I mean, Fabulating Futures, I think that is the thing, part of, there's this tendency towards individualization instead of individuation already in our societies. And I think this is something that anarchism really, and also Deleuze and Guattari actually really emphasize, is the collective, right? Mm-hmm. Especially Guattari in his own work, the group, the collective, the subject group, the group of enunciation. For me, that is really important because I think we live very individualized lives because life has moved us all in that way. Communities aren't quite as close-knit as they used to be. It's also not so easy to find like your people. Like when I was younger and you were a goth, you wore certain kinds of, makeup or clothing, and you went to a club and you saw the person that looked like you and you were like, maybe they listen to the same music I do. Maybe they're thinking the same thoughts as I do. And you kind of start talking, right? So there's so much less of that kind of subculture going around these days. There aren't really places. I mean, you can do it online. I think online, I often critique online, I know, in my work, but I do think that there is also a space where this kind of thing does happen online. And you can see it, especially, for like trans communities, for example, and the kinds of not only aid, but also support and just care they have found. And so I think that there's really, when we're talking about fabulating futures, it has to be a collective endeavor. And that is very difficult, living the way we do. And so counter-actualizing the present and calling forth the future is a kind of collective experimentation. And I think, it can take so many forms. It doesn't have to take one form. All it has to do is spark spark a different way of being for you, whether that's trying to live communally with other people, whether that's participating in something like Food Not Bombs, whether it's having an online community, it doesn't really matter. Even having a reading group, you can have a reading group that can stimulate different thought. It doesn't have to be like throwing Molotov cocktails and, even though it might be. So I think that there is space for protest and this thing around violence is very tricky because, of course, because of the sort of early propaganda by the deed part of anarchism. So I want to talk very carefully about this when I talk about it. But it was also blown out of proportion because that is what the media did, right? Then already. And so I think that there's this kind of bad rap that anarchism got. That's kind of just the stigma has stuck with it. But I think that there is a place for violence sometimes. And Natasha Leonard talks about the impossibility of nonviolence. And she calls it counterviolence. And I love that. Yeah. It's not violence that's for no reason. It's when there is the impossibility of nonviolent action. Because no anarchist, maybe there are one or two, but I think for the most part, anarchists don't want to go out and, protest and get involved in like violent action or, where you're kind of hugging trees or kind of, keeping the bulldozers, like literally from cutting the tree or whatever. Those end up being quite hurtful sometimes to people themselves. But that's usually when people don't see another way of being heard or changing things. And so as I say, I want to be careful about that. And that's actually why I didn't want to write about revolution at first. But I felt that I couldn't not talk about it because it is an integral part of anarchist thought. And it is also a very integral part of Deleuze and Guattari's thought. And they call it different things maybe, but there is a kind of revolutionary impulse. And I think that is kind of, that links again to the Fabulating Futures. It's that revolutionary impulse, a kind of collective action towards calling forth the future that doesn't exist.
It is interesting to go back to the idea, I guess, the web and perhaps the algorithmic element of the book. I think it is kind of interesting that, it's like the dominant usage of these things or these tools, these social media tools seems to be working against our favor, but there are those opportunities. Obviously, Taylor and I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Twitter, which is kind of interesting. I've met my roommate, I've met so many people, even to speak to just the trans community online. We both interact pretty regularly with a pretty, vibrant trans community and, anarchist, communists, etc. And I think that's been great for us as, we're like the white guys, like we, play sports, etc. Like, you know what I mean? We're kind of the, the little ideal subject or whatever, faciality of capitalism, etc. So I think that has been something that has enriched, I think, both of our lives and just being able to experience, interacting with people of different walks of life. Even in a city like Austin, I'm not encountering in conversations with trans people in real life that frequently. I think that's been sort of a generative aspect of it, but I don't know if you don't mind, perhaps we could discuss a little bit of this element, your kind of discussion of cybernetics a bit and kind of the algorithmic society. These are things that are very interesting to me. Baudrillard is kind of fascinating for me. And I think that could even go back into the recursivity aspect, with the simulacra, etc. I don't know. I'd just be kind of curious to hear, maybe elaborate a bit on, you kind of draw from Mackenzie Work's work with regard to, I guess, this sort of the way that flows of information and this sort of post-neoliberal like evolution of capital. I don't know if you want to, maybe we could generate a little conversation on this topic before we close out the episode.
I mean, that for me is something that is really interesting, and it's really where my work has gone. Is kind of thinking more about this. And I think in the book, I take quite a negative view of cybernetics because I read Tiquin mainly, and I've now read a lot of cybernetics and changed my mind quite a lot. I think cybernetics is such a wide field, and it's different in the US than in the UK. And there's also Russian cybernetics. And, there are all these different kinds of strands, and they all do different things. And it's not all bad, but I guess Tickman does point to something when they start talking about the cybernetic episteme, which I would maybe prefer to call algorithmic societies. And of course, we know that Deleuze already sort of hints towards this or at this in the postscript, but this is quite late in his life. And so for me, in some ways, Stigler actually picks up that project because he spends, he's one of the few continental philosophers who really spent almost his entire career thinking about digitality and how it's changing thought and, kind of almost interrupting our knowledges. And I guess one of the things that is really interesting for me is this idea of pharmacology that he brings up, talking about the pharmacological situation, seeing kind of digitality as a pharmacon, where it has this potential for all these positive things that you've just been discussing. But at the same time, there's a lack of care. It also causes all these other things that we're seeing, like technological overdependence, techno-solutionism, all this kind of thing that I think is more negative. But I think the thing that is really interesting to me is, where he starts talking about what memory is or time binding. Actually, it's about time binding. Our experience of ourselves as time binding subjects and also of society as a kind of time binding structure. And so, one of the things that I started thinking about is I started thinking about this in terms of inscription. Well, he talks about it in terms of retention and protension, sort of drawing on Husserl. And it's really this idea of the externalization of memory. Now, of course, we have always done this. This is not unique to digitality. And in some ways, we can think of the development of the opposable thumb as the beginning of externalization of memory, because this allows us to start creating tools and artifacts. And there are many ways in which we externalize our memory, including communal ways, right? Through rituals or markings, territorial markings, as Deleuze and Guattari would talk about. And that sort of aids intergenerational or the transmission of intergenerational memory, which is so important for knowledge of how to live. This is the thing that really interests Stigler. And it's actually the thing that I think, as I said earlier, is something that interests Deleuze and Guattari in terms of, we can think about it in terms of circuit building. How do we build circuits? So Deleuze and Guattari will talk about it in terms of the refrain or body without organs. Simondon and Stigler will talk about it in terms of individuation and transindividuation, and so some more ontogenetic processes. But that's kind of the crux, right? Is now what is happening when these knowledges become more and more knowledges of how to live. He talks about savoir-faire and savoir-vivre. And so it's these knowledges of how to live and be in the world. And what happens when that becomes automated and just kind of externalized to the extent, as he says, that we're always dreaming the next level of self-exosomatization. And so it's this like, there's something really profound that is happening. And this is where I think this is what makes me angry about AI ethics. It doesn't pose questions, it doesn't pose the right questions because it asks things about opacity and bias and power accumulation. And all of this is important, but it doesn't ask the more underlying question, which is, do we need technologies to look the way they do? Do we need to be accumulating data in the ways that we are already? What do we want our societies to look like? And once we've thought about that, what would the role of technology be in that society? So that's a different question. And so for me, that is the question that, that is sort of at the forefront of maybe Stigler's philosophy, but also important for me is like, okay, so these knowledges of how to live, they're just becoming automated, and we are aiding that process of exosomatization, right? This kind of taking our memory and dumping it into what he calls hypomnesic artifacts. something like your cell phone, right? So tools would also be a hypermnesic kind of artifact. But if you think about what we do with cell phones, think about how often people, you take photos and you never look at it again. So there's not that curation of photos. Used to be something that was really linked to memory, and you would look at it and you would discuss it with your family. And there was something that happened. There was a kind of knowledge transfer that happened in that process. You're learning, at your mother's or your grandmother's or your father's kind of feet almost of how to live. And now that is kind of being automated, I think this comes right back to the question of fabulating futures. How do we fabulate futures if we don't have the knowledge of how to live? And so that's a big question. And I think there are many different answers to it. I don't think it's hopeless. This for me is the wonderful thing about Stigler's philosophy of care, really. And I think we do need to produce a kind of politics of care again, taking care of the pharmacological situation, not even just of ourselves and of each other, but of this situation that we find ourselves in, and finding ways to understand how we can collectively redistribute intensities in such a way that we become the quasi-cause of the future. And so that for me is kind of, I guess, some of the stuff that I was thinking about towards the end of the book.
Along these lines, to kind of build on this, because you also discuss, I want to maybe bring up this notion of what the algorithmic society looks like and how that's different. Because I think one of the interesting ways that you phrase this in the work is that it's like the mitigation of risk is like the new sort of paradigm, this sort of infoeconomic milieu, perhaps, that sort of sits on top of like the productive economy, and how these flows of information are now kind of, and this is again to draw from McKinsey work a little bit, how that is sort of becoming, like you discussed, data collection at mass scale, that getting mobilized against us again, and that goes back to the security. What are the risks as far as not only within the market, perhaps, black swan events, etc., but what are the risks to the state? What are the threats to the state? If we can sort of data collect at these massive scales and use algorithms to analyze that data, and we can sort of point out, okay, almost like the kind of pre-crime, that's the maybe far-fetched future aspect of it. But I think perhaps this falls into that notion of like the digital panopticon or something. So yeah. I don't know if you want to discuss a little bit about this kind of transition you kind of see between the prior kind of era of neoliberalism that's not really, it's sort of still there, but another layer of abstraction on top of that.
I like this idea of the digital panopticon. That's a very good way of thinking about it. And what kind of, thinks about even sort of class distribution in a different way, about the hacker class and the vectorialist class. And so those that are producing information and those who own the lines on which these information, the kinds of information that we're producing, are produced. Data being one of them. When you're thinking about what happens with all of this data, there's an interesting logic, and it is the logic of the derivative.
Yes.
That is kind of in there. Because what is the derivative? It's literally hedging your bets, right? That's what it is. That's what it does. And so when you start thinking about things like hedge funds and all of these things that go with it, it's a way of thinking about risk that makes risk.
Right,
That kind of, it mobilizes risk, right?
Yeah. I was thinking credit default swaps being the like obvious connection.
Exactly.
There, please.
It's exactly that. So it's a different way of understanding risk. Whereas before, we tried to kind of ward off risk, right? So risk was thought of in a very different way. Now risk is just kind of part of the program. Okay, there is risk. So let's mobilize this. Let's think about, how we can use risk.
Right, as a tool, yeah.
As a tool. And so I think, this is also what data does. The thing is, with algorithms kind of sifting through these masses of data, we don't know what the emergent properties of those algorithmic processes are. They don't necessarily learn what we want them to learn or what we would learn, right? The way they optimize clusters of data is a little bit different to what a human might. And so what emerges from that is always that kind of thing that is emerging from it, that is itself mobilizing that risk. And so a very good example of this is, or a horrible example of this is, of course, what do they call it? Predictive policing, which it's basically aimed at risk. It's aimed at kind of defining risk before it's even there. And so what does that do? It does something very strange to subjectivity, because it kind of makes us all into that risk. We become part of this kind of system of risk. And it's not any longer something like having insurance against risk, but actually utilizing that risk for a different end. And it is for the end of capitalism, obviously. But I think, it's had it's got unexpected outcomes. And I think that's the thing that I think it's because technology is in a way changing faster than what theory is keeping up with.
Oh, yeah.
I think that there are actually good theorists out there now, like really grappling with this and kind of, sort of becoming a little bit more speculative, which is what I think we actually need, because we need something that can counter this kind of risk thinking. And I think a kind of speculative thinking is almost what we need to do that. And it's quite difficult because I think in a way it's a challenge for philosophy itself. It's a challenge for how we do philosophy, because philosophy is typically something that takes time and is long. And there must be space for that. That must continue to happen. We can't just get rid of that. But I do think that we ourselves have to maybe take a little bit of risk and sort of go into the speculative to think about what it is that we need theoretically to kind of counter-actualize these kinds of algorithmic flows and the kind of derivative logic that is at play.
Yeah, I think this idea of the derivative logic is very fascinating, because I think obviously there's like the twin or like parallels between the economic derivative and I think the cultural derivative. I think of something like, you brought up memes earlier. I mean, what is a meme? But that's like there's that weird like mirroring of these detached abstractions that are just these kind of self-referential, auto-poetic memes. They take on a life of their own, right? And they just zoom off. So there's like that aspect. But another topic just relative to finance and I guess algorithms and the economy would be, we've had high frequency trading algorithms. That's not even that new of a technology or like application for this sort of process. Basically, the high frequency trading algorithms have already captured the market such that the retail investor, the individual investor, can't really compete because the algorithms can trade at a speed or whatever. Like you can set thresholds that obviously, a human being has to operate in time and space. The algorithms don't. So you're already at this tremendous disadvantage, even if you're playing within the capitalist market. So there's that aspect. But what I'm wondering is what's going to happen when these AI trading models, because this is coming. Like this is going to be the next thing. Is like, it's going to be computers trading back each other. What are they going to do? Are they going to arrange for crashes? Are they going to like sabotage other things? Because I don't think we're that far from a space where an AI will be able to steal someone's voice and make a call or log into crack your whatever. There could be bad actors, etc. So I guess that's maybe there could be bad actors towards the state, let's say, that can mobilize that technology, but also, on the other side, we have to be cautious about that too. So I don't know, that's just something that I thought of. I don't know if you have a take on maybe this derivative cultural aspect would be the more interesting path to go down. Just to see what you think about that.
I mean, I think what you're saying is totally, it's on its way. I think we've seen big jumps in AI, what we call AI, in the last 2 years, right? With ChatGPT and the kind of Midjourney and the kind of more artistic equivalents. Something has happened, right? I read this lovely article the other day, and they talk about it as stochastic parrots, and I quite love that idea because obviously there's always space for actors. We're already seeing that derivative logic. We're already seeing that with disinformation. If you think about bots do to spread disinformation, that is a kind of derivative logic right there. And so that is something that can actually be teased out quite a bit more, especially if you're thinking along these lines of, okay, there's in the kind of financial way, in the cultural way, and, there are these kind of parallels that we're seeing. And I
mean,
guess
it's flows at the end of the day, right? Like
it
whether it be
flows.
information or, it's kind
Yeah.
of following at least
Yeah.
similar context.
Exactly. I think the thing is to understand, if you can start understanding the logics underlying what is happening, it becomes easier to ask better questions. And I think that's what is so difficult, is kind of keeping up with how these technologies are changing and what they're doing. So if you think about ChatGPT-3, there was this big thing in academia, what are we going to do about plagiarism and all of that? But again, for me, that's maybe the wrong question. What's interesting for me about something like ChatGPT-3 is that it's drawing on the history of human endeavor that is available on the internet.
Right, yeah.
And it's kind of mirroring back our own consciousness to us, right? Or what we've produced. For example, when ChatGPT lies, it has this proclivity for just taking facts and just presenting it. That's interesting for me because that is reflecting something about what we do sometimes, right? You just say stuff. Yeah, and I think demystifying, that's the big thing. Demystifying how these technologies work. Because I think that for me has been something that I've really been trying to do for myself, even just really reading so much about how these technologies work. Like, what is a deep neural network? Why is it called deep? Why is it called the neural network? What is an algorithm? What is an algorithmic process? And when you start thinking about, there's a great little book called Revolutionary Mathematics, and it talks about the conversion from frequent statistics to Bayesian statistics and how that is used in machine learning. And just understanding these kind of processes has really, for me, opened up a different way of thinking about them theoretically, because it's not such a black box anymore, to use that kind of algorithmic terminology. And I think this is actually maybe something that needs to be part of even our education programs, even philosophy programs, is just demystifying what it is that we're talking about. Because I think there's a kind of power in that, right? There's a kind of power in keeping these technologies kind of obscure or their workings obscure.
Right, yeah, exactly.
And even the kinds of things that we say, I accept, and that kind of like, what you're giving consent to.
Right, the EULA.
And of course, I think Shoshana Zuboff actually talks about how intricate that is. Like if you really know what you're giving consent to, you would have to understand all these
right.
legal terms.
Exactly.
And, so obviously we just all say accept, and, there's the cookie and the whatever. But I think that there's, for me, something really about that. If we're going to have philosophy live up to what it is supposed to do in our current societies, I think we have to understand, we have to grapple with what is around us in the same way that Deleuze and Guattari really went and grappled with what was happening around them. When they talk about all these different things in 1,000 Plateaus, it's because they really went and grappled with all these different aspects of life, of their milieu. And I think we need something similar.
I don't know if you paid attention to the GameStop situation with GameStop, which is, they sell video games, etc., consoles, blah, 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 reselling. Something was going on with the stock. I can't remember the specifics if it got bought out or there was the stock was tanking. Actually, just people on Reddit in particular, there was this Wall Street Bets group that were kind of fighting against the institutional traders. They were shorting the stock. It was kind of a big thing for maybe it was last summer or so. I forget when this kind of came to a head, but I think it's interesting in this regard. They halted trading. There was all these measures that the sort of stock market, the exchanges took to mitigate the losses caused by these people just using the internet technology to band together and mobilize in this resistance way, even though it's kind of still within the logic of capital because it's obviously stock trading, but it just shows that there is something else going on, because even within the logic of capital and investment, there's an antagonism between those two logics, right? Of like, if regular investors are doing this, then we have to put a stop to it, right? So I think there's something very significant about that, especially with economic power, et cetera. So I don't know if you have a response there. If not, I have a follow-up on something that slightly switches gears.
I don't have anything to add to that. I think it's a very interesting example.
Just switch gears a little bit while staying on this kind of cybernetic online or digital media discussion. I thought this was quite interesting, this notion that you bring up in the book of partial transference with regard to social media interactions. This is super interesting to me. As someone who is pretty much addicted to Twitter, I think there's something here, right? There's something interesting about interacting with people. I mean, I have people that I've never met. I don't know what they look like. I don't know their actual names. I really know absolutely nothing about them, but we've interacted for, at this point, like 5 or 6 years. I have people that I've known, and this kind of weird, I know them, but I don't know them. It's such an odd thing. So I don't know if you have anything to say about this.
That partial transference. Well, it's interesting, right? Because, I mean, if you think about transference in the kind of psychoanalytic way, they even talk about transference between a kind of client and a psychoanalyst or that kind of thing. And I think when I was writing about this and this kind of partial transference, I was also thinking about the short-circuiting of drives that Stigler talks about. But, again, I think that we have to be, or me also, have to be careful of just making these, and I know sometimes when you write, one does that, right? Or when you talk, you just sort of make these almost more polemical statements. And I think that partial transference can be positive or negative in the sense that it can allow for a kind of real connection between people in a different setting. At the same time, it can sometimes shortcut what could have happened in a different kind of setting. So for example, let's say somebody wants to befriend me on Facebook and I allow them to befriend me and I think, okay, we're friends. That is a kind of almost botched transference, right? Because we're not friends.
Right.
But we could become friends. So that partial transference is almost itself a pharmacon, right? It can be positive, but it can also be a substitute for something else.
Yeah, there's still that element of alienation. Would be hesitant to describe it more, but especially with Twitter, there's this is super interesting to me because of like the sort of free associative process of Twitter or tweeting. At least the way that I do it typically is kind of like, it's kind of like flushing out the machinic unconscious. Like that's what tweets. It's not me tweeting, it's the machinic unconscious that does things. There is this sort of say anything ethos to some degree that sort of mirrors, in a certain way, the kind of analytic, I guess, relation or what have you. But I don't know. I just think that's such an interesting, fascinating way. Like you said, partial transference. That's the best way to sort of understand it. But
and it's quite quick, right? It's also it lends itself to being, that transference is almost instantaneous. It's not
very true.
This thing that takes on a different kind of temporality to what we're used to thinking, of transference, in a kind of more clinical setup, which would take time to occur. And so there's something, it is very interesting, I think I don't actually tease it out enough in the book. I think that there's something very interesting.
Yeah, there's probably a whole book on just this notion of partial transference. And I think I'm perhaps being too speculative with regard to this kind of psychoanalysis via Twitter or the digital space, but I don't know, there is some weird, we're kind of seeing the same process in a way, and I, maybe feeling it out and trying to figure out like exactly what's going on.
There's a remark that Guattari makes in one of his seminars that I bootleg translated. If anyone's interested, you can track it down. But he makes this kind of offhand comment where faciality traits, I come into contact with you, and despite my best efforts, these little traits are now stuck and kind of glued onto my way of facializing my faciality machine, and vice versa. So there's something too about like just the way we interact on social media, whether it be Twitter or whatnot. There are these little traits, linguistic traits. There are, ways of phrasing. I think this gets back to the discussion of memes too, where they take on a life of their own, not just, propagating themselves, but also sort of influencing and creating these different lines of thinking and flight. And so, that would be how I would kind of parse partial transference. Because like Cooper said, you can quote unquote know these people, you can have truck with them, as Haraway might say, for years without knowing them as we might think of knowing people in real life. And yet they have made all of these subtle impacts on perhaps how we think, how we speak, how we sort of even interact online, these little transferences that can sort of bifurcate and go off and have these unintended consequences, which is why I think, the way Cooper talks about sort of on his anonymous account, sort of the say anything principle, whereas the way that we interact on the sort of the show account, yes, there is a sense of freedom and play, but for the most part, like it's a little bit more serious, a little bit more curated. And yet at the same time, there's, like he said before the show, the way I interact, sometimes I'll post quotes, like the quote I mentioned to you about becoming worthy of the event, of what happens to us, or some sort of interesting, perhaps more academic way. But at the same time, there's still, there's ways of interacting online that we have these influences, and without really knowing it, kind of like in real life in that sense, but without the aspect of, usually without, on Twitter at least, the aspect of faciality, right? Which is kind of what Freud was trying to ward off by seating behind the patient. There's no face here, right? No judgment, even though that's, to get back to the order word, that's what they say is within every order word, there's that judgment, there's that little death sentence, right? So that's the positive and negative of, I suppose, transference. I do think, Coop, unless you have something else, we could allow Chantelle to kind of maybe reiterate, you could tell us what you're working on. You mentioned it sort of before, but maybe just to remind us what is the next big thing, the next research project. That way we can kind of get a sense of how you're fabulating your future. And we can sort of...
I don't watch it.
Well, we'll know what to look forward to you and kind of be able to think out along the trajectory you're traveling.
I've got sort of 2 or 3 projects brewing, and the first one is a sort of shorter project that I would like to get out quite soon, which is a kind of sexy short book on cybernetics.
Nice. Okay.
But a kind of, I want to write something different to what's been written. And the thing that is interesting me is actually the kind of bastard offspring of cybernetics. So the more artistic interpretations and how we can mobilize that philosophically, in the same way that Deleuze and Guattari use kind of artistic projects to think philosophy. And so there's something that's kind of brewing for me at the moment. And I just wanted to do something that's not the same as all the other stuff being done on cybernetics, even though I find all of it very interesting. And I'm kind of like trying to read a lot and see the different perspectives. There are the sort of very pro, against, more neutral ones. And I think, so that's one of the things I think, and that was actually sparked by a critique I got from someone who reviewed my book and didn't like the kind of negative Tiquin slant I took on cybernetics. And I was like, okay, I'm going to look at this. This is interesting to me. I want to see what there is then behind this. And so that kind of sparked that. I want to write a book on redundancy. And I feel like this is going to be a difficult, hard book because I want to trace this from kind of Plato to Laruelle. That's my
that's ambitious.
Yes, it's a lot of reading ahead of me, but I think I've actually grappled with this for a very long time, and I've actually written a little bit on this in terms of the a priori and in Deleuze and Foucault. But I didn't quite call it redundancy because I think my thinking was still kind of gestating, and but it is a kind of, it's a concept in the same way that difference and repetition were these like sort of pivotal concepts for Deleuze that has really started interesting me and thinking about this in the kind of trajectory of philosophy, and sort of specifically the kind of philosophies, sort of older philosophies, but then as we get to the philosophies, or what they call the philosophies of the concept, and kind of, because something new starts happening there, whether you're thinking about sort of Bachelard talking about historical breaks, or Foucault kind of more thinking in terms of, genealogies and archaeologies and so on. And then Deleuze and Guattari, I think, do something different with it. And I think that there's a kind of, as I'm starting to read Laruelle, I'm starting to find something interesting there. Redundancy for me is something that, again, I think that there is a negative aspect to redundancy, which is obvious, when you think of something being redundant or being obsolete, there's that kind of sense. But there's also the redundancy in the sense of the more positive sense of what Deleuze and Guattari might call the refrain, which for them is not only, for them, there's that linkage between chaos and earth and cosmos. So it's a kind of cosmological thinking that is bound up for me in this concept. And so that's something, I don't know how long that's going to take, but that I feel that will be either my tomb or my tome. We'll see where that goes. But I think that's the sort of bigger project. I guess that would be my very philosophical work.
This idea, I guess, of Bifo calls it semiocapital, that's something that I find fascinating, this kind of like confluence of economics, technology, and information. That is what gets me excited. I mean, like I said, that's sort of why I kind of wound up here, to be honest. So both of those sound like very interesting. We definitely would love to have you back at a future date to discuss those. Definitely have enjoyed today's discussion. I just want to point out, I just noticed that you have a copy of Dune on your bookshelf.
I am a sci-fi.
Are you? Okay.
Buff. I read a lot of sci-fi, and it kind of got worse during COVID. I think it was my way of dealing with the sort of existential uncertainty. I just read more and more sci-fi, even though I do read a lot of sci-fi anyway. I guess that there's something really, there is something quite magical. I've always had this idea that I want to teach a course on sci-fi and philosophy through sci-fi. So when you were talking about Dune earlier, it really resonated for me, because I just thought,
perfect.
when I read, what was that, Anne Leckie, Ancillary Justice, the sort of war machine, I was like, oh, I could teach my students the war machine this way. They would understand it, because there was just something for me that happened. And I think sci-fi has a really interesting, of course, there's also just a lot of space opera stuff. Yeah. And sometimes I even enjoy that. But but I think that there's really interesting sci-fi at the moment. I think that there was, in the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s, and then there was a kind of lull for me where it just didn't excite me so much.
Right.
And sort of recently again, I just fallen in love with this genre all over again. Yes, just for the possibilities, and so, yes, I do definitely have Dune.
I'm curious, have you read any of the other books in the series beyond the first one?
No, me neither.
No, gotcha. The really interesting stuff philosophically begins in the third and the fourth books. Those are the ones, it gets very sort of almost didactic for Frank Herbert, who's just basically spouting his kind of personal philosophy. So if you can make it through the sort of, it's almost like the Empire Strikes Back would be Dune Messiah, because it really deconstructs the whole rise of Paul Muad'Dib, etc. On a more important or relevant note for your work, I don't know if you're familiar with Dorothea Olkowski's work, but she has that book on Deleuze, Merleau-Ponty, and I forget who else was it?
Bergson, yeah.
But she draws.
Yes, and I haven't read it.
Gotcha. Okay, but you are familiar, because she. The reason I bring it up is because she mobilizes the three-body problem to work out some of that, at least early on in the book, which I thought was kind of something interesting. And she kind of has that. That's kind of her angle there. But
I'm definitely going to find it. Yeah.
And I like the notion of teaching philosophy and science fiction. You know, there's in the Larawell that I'm co-translating with my friend Rocco Gangle. We're revising it slowly, but we're at this section towards the end of the book where he starts talking about what he calls philofiction, which is something he's worked about. Yeah. So, you know, that could be, you know, maybe that's within the parameters of what you'll be looking at with redundancy. But, you know, I definitely would love to have you back to talk more about how Deleuze and Guattari mobilize, especially Guattari mobilizes redundancy, which we focused on redundancies of resonance, which is obviously a part of the state form and perhaps more of the negative side, whereas Guattari too wants to propose these notions of redundancies of interaction that can possibly have these transformative effects too, that are so important for we could say the cautious optimism of your work, right? So, you know, that's definitely something I'm looking forward to in the future and has always fascinated me. We definitely look forward to that. And we want to thank you again for being generous with your time and spending time with us. It's really been just a joy having you on today.
Thank you. It's been really lovely. You've sparked so many ideas for me.
Oh,
so
nice.
I'm going to go write them all down now.
We're doing the Spinoza thing. We're increasing our power and potency.
Yes, that's right. We're what a body can do. Exactly. Well, Chantelle, thank you again for joining us today, and we'll be in touch. I know next week is around this time next weekend, the episode will come out, and so we'll let you know as soon as it does. And just really want to thank you again, and I look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
Thank you so much.
And once again, thanks to Chantelle Gray for joining Taylor and I on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour.
The rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.